Welcome back to Timeless Thinkers, where history's greatest minds speak again, and where we explore the ideas that shaped our world. I'm your host, and we've journeyed through Machiavelli's political realism, Hobbes's terrifying justification for absolute sovereignty, and Locke's revolutionary argument for limited government based on natural rights and consent. Today, we meet the philosopher who said both Hobbes and Locke had missed something fundamental. Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that the social contract theories of his predecessors had created illegitimate governments disguised as legitimate ones. True political freedom, he claimed, required something far more radical: permanent popular sovereignty, where the people themselves remain the ultimate legislated power. This is the story of The Social Contract, published in 1762, and how Jean-Jacques Rousseau transformed political philosophy by arguing that legitimate authority requires not just consent, but continuous direct democratic participation in creating the general will, a vision that would inspire the French Revolution and establish the conceptual foundations of modern democracy. Rousseau was born on June 28, 1712, in Geneva, Switzerland, a city-state with republican traditions that would profoundly shape his political thinking. His mother died shortly after childbirth, leaving him to be raised by his father, a watchmaker, who filled young Rousseau's imagination with ancient republican heroes from Plutarch's lives. This idealized vision of ancient civic virtue contrasted sharply with the reality of 18th century European society that Rousseau would encounter. At age 10, his father fled Geneva after a quarrel, abandoning Rousseau to relatives and apprenticeships. By 16, Rousseau had left Geneva, beginning a life of wandering that would take him across Europe and expose him to every stratum of society, from servants' quarters to aristocratic salons. Unlike Hobbes and Locke, who were educated at Oxford and moved in elite intellectual circles, Rousseau was largely self-taught and never fully belonged to any social class. This outsider perspective gave him a uniquely critical view of European civilization. While enlightening philosophers celebrated progress, reason, and commercial society, Rousseau would become civilization's most profound critic. Rousseau's intellectual breakthrough came in 1749 while walking to visit his friend Denis Diderot, imprisoned for his radical writings. Reading an essay question from the Academy of Dijon, "Has the restoration of the sciences and arts tended to purify morals?" Rousseau experienced what he called an illumination. His answer, which won the prize, shocked Enlightenment Paris. No, the arts and sciences had corrupted rather than improved humanity. This discourse on the sciences and arts established Rousseau's reputation as a provocateur, but it was his discourse on the origins and foundations of inequality among men in 1755 that contained his revolutionary anthropological and political theory. Where Hobbes saw the state of nature as violent war, and Locke saw it as inconvenient but governed by natural law, Rousseau imagined primitive humans as solitary, peaceful beings living in harmony with nature. But this natural condition was disrupted by a catastrophic development. Rousseau wrote one of philosophy's most famous sentences: "The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought himself of saying, 'This is mine,' and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society." Private property introduced inequality, competition, and dependence, transforming peaceful natural humans into competitive social beings. By 1762, when The Social Contract was published alongside his novel Emile, Rousseau had become one of Europe's most controversial intellectuals. Both books were immediately condemned and banned in Paris and Geneva. He fled to Switzerland, then to England, spending his final years in France under an assumed name. He died in 1778, 11 years before the French Revolution would vindicate his theories
in blood and terror. To understand how Rousseau reimagines political legitimacy, we must first understand his dramatically different account of the state of nature, one that challenges both Hobbes and Locke at their foundations. For Hobbes, the state of nature was a war of all against all. For Locke, it was a condition of freedom with inconveniences. Rousseau argues both accounts project characteristics of social man back onto natural man. They described people corrupted by society and imagined them in the state of nature. Rousseau's natural man is radically different, not yet fully human as we understand. He lacks language, complex reason, moral concepts, and self-consciousness. He is essentially a clever animal, satisfied with meeting basic needs: food, shelter, reproduction. He lives dispersed across the landscape, encountering others rarely. Two characteristics define natural man: amour de soi and pitié. Amour de soi is healthy self-love, instinct for self-preservation without comparison to others. Pitié is natural compassion, instinctive aversion to seeing others suffer. These characteristics make the state of nature peaceful. Crucially, natural man is independent. He depends on no one, needs no one's recognition, compares himself to no one. This independence is freedom in its purest form. Physical inequalities exist, but matter little because there's no property to accumulate, no status to compete for. This directly contradicts Hobbes. Where Hobbes saw war as natural, Rousseau sees peace. Where Hobbes saw humans as naturally competitive, Rousseau sees these as products of society. The state of nature reveals that many characteristics we assume are human nature are actually products of specific social conditions. But Rousseau isn't suggesting we return to nature. That's impossible. Social development brought genuine goods: language, culture, moral sentiments. The question becomes, if natural freedom was lost through irreversible social development, and if existing societies are corrupt, is legitimate social order possible?
The state of nature's peace was destroyed by private property. The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought himself of saying, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. From how many crimes, wars, and murders might not anyone have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes? This isn't Locke's labor theory, where mixing labor with nature creates legitimate ownership. For Rousseau, property is theft, an audacious claim backed by force or fraud. Property introduces comparison and dependence. Once someone says, "This is mine," others must match them. Accumulation begins. Natural inequality becomes social inequality. Property creates dependence in multiple ways. The rich depend on the poor to work their land and recognize their status. The poor depend on the rich for access to resources. Everyone depends on social recognition. The independent natural man becomes the social man who relies on others' wills. This dependence corrupts amour de soi into amour propre, inflamed self-love that seeks superiority. You no longer care simply that you have enough. You care that you have more than others. You seek to dominate. You value what others think of you rather than what you are. Amour propre becomes the source of human misery. It creates vanity, envy, pride, and desperate need for others' approval. The richest person is enslaved to public opinion as much as the poorest. Faced with securing their holdings, the rich invented government through a fraudulent social contract. Let us unite to protect the weak from oppression. The poor, deceived, accepted. They thought they were creating peace.
Actually, they were legitimizing inequality and trading freedom for subjugation. This is Rousseau's devastating critique. For Hobbes, the contract creates legitimate sovereignty. Rousseau responds, the war is created by property, and the contract legitimizes robbery. For Locke, government protects pre-existing rights. Rousseau responds, property rights are illegitimate, so government protecting them is doubly so. If existing governments are illegitimate, what hope exists? Rousseau's answer will be radical.
Rousseau faces his central challenge: to find a form of association which will defend and protect with the whole common force the person and goods of each associate, and in which each, while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone and remain as free as before. How can you enter civil society while remaining as free as before? In nature, you were free because you obeyed only your own will. How can political association preserve this? Both Hobbes and Locke failed to solve this. Hobbes created absolute sovereignty where subjects obey the sovereign's will. Locke's limited government still involves obeying laws decided by representatives. In both cases, you obey another's will. Rousseau's solution: each of us puts his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will, and in our corporate capacity, we receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole. Each person gives themselves completely to the community, not to a ruler or representatives, but to the collective body. This total alienation seems to create absolute power over individuals, contradicting the goal of preserving freedom. But Rousseau argues this preserves freedom for three reasons. First, each gives himself to all, so to nobody in particular. There's no person who has power over you that you don't equally share. Second, the alienation is mutual and total, so conditions are equal for all. Third, in obeying the general will, you obey only yourself, because you're part of that will's formation. The social contract creates a moral and collective body, the sovereign, composed of all citizens as active participants in legislation. This sovereign cannot be represented, cannot be divided, and must concern itself only with the common interest. Rousseau distinguishes between the sovereign, the people as legislative power, and the government, the administrative body executing laws. The people must remain sovereign, continuously exercising legislative power, while delegating only executive functions. This is radical direct democracy. The people don't elect representatives to make laws. That would alienate sovereignty. The people themselves must assemble regularly to exercise legislative power. Any law not ratified by the people in person is void. You trade natural freedom for civil freedom. You can no longer do whatever you want, but you're protected by law, and you participate equally in making that law. Most importantly, you obey only rules you've helped create. The general will is Rousseau's most original and controversial contribution. It's also his most misunderstood concept. First, what it is not. It is not the will of all, not simply the sum of individual preferences. Rousseau explicitly distinguishes between these. The will of all is aggregate preference, add up what each wants. This might involve majorities benefiting themselves at minorities' expense. The general will is not about what each person happens to want, but about what's genuinely in the common interest. It's the will directed at the common good, concerning what we share as citizens rather than what divides us as private individuals. How do we identify it? When citizens deliberate properly, without factions or manipulation, and vote on laws, the general will emerges. If citizens ask not what's best for me, but what's best for us as a community, and each votes their honest judgment, then majority rule approximates the general will. This requires conditions. First, citizens must be relatively equal in wealth and status. Second, They must possess civic virtue, caring about the common good. Third, there must be no partial associations or factions. And fourth, citizens must be informed and deliberate seriously. When these conditions are met, the majority vote identifies the general will, not because the majority creates it, but because they discover it. The general will exists objectively as what's genuinely in the common interest. This explains Rousseau's most notorious phrase, "Those who refuse to obey the general will shall be compelled to do so by the whole body." This means nothing less than that he will be forced to be free. Rousseau's logic: if the general will genuinely represents the common interest, and you're part of the community whose common interest it serves, then obeying it is obeying something actually in your interest as a citizen, even if it conflicts with your immediate private preference. You're forced to obey your better self. But this raises problems. Who determines what the general will is? What if I genuinely believe a law doesn't serve the common good? Rousseau's answer: if you're in the minority when the law is voted on, this shows you're mistaken. The majority has revealed your judgment was wrong. This eliminates space for conscientious objection or minority rights. If the majority always reveals the general will, and obeying it is freedom, then majorities can't never tyrannize minorities. Rousseau does set limits. The general will must concern general matters, laws applying to all. It must aim at the common interest, not factional advantage. But he isn't always clear about these limits or how they're protected. The general will provided theoretical foundation for popular sovereignty. It inspired democratic movements, but it also provided language that revolutionary governments would use to justify suppressing dissent in the people's name.
Having established that legitimate government requires the general will, Rousseau argues sovereignty cannot be transferred, delegated, or represented. It must remain permanently with the people who exercise it only directly. For Hobbes, sovereignty is transferred completely when people create the social contract. For Locke, sovereignty resides in the people, but they delegate it to representatives. Both involve alienating sovereignty. Rousseau argues both are wrong because sovereignty by its nature cannot be transferred without destroying itself. Why? Because sovereignty means exercising the general will, and the general will cannot be represented. When you vote on whether a law serves the common good, no one can vote for you. Your representative has their own will, not yours. Sovereignty cannot be represented for the same reason that it cannot be alienated. The deputies of the people are not and cannot be its representatives. They are merely its commissioners. Any law which the people have not ratified in person is void. This means representative democracy isn't really democracy. Rousseau mocks the English system. The English people believes itself to be free. It is gravely mistaken. It is free only during the election of members of parliament. As soon as the members are elected, the people is enslaved. Elections don't make you free if what you elect is masters who make laws for you. True freedom requires direct participation in making the laws you obey.
This requires direct democracy, citizens assembling regularly to debate and vote on laws themselves. Rousseau acknowledges this is difficult in large states. It works best in small republics where citizens can actually gather. Large states inevitably tend toward aristocracy or monarchy because they cannot maintain direct participation. This seems to make legitimate government impossible for large nations. Rousseau essentially accepts this. He is skeptical that large states can be legitimate. They require representation, which alienates sovereignty. Even if representatives were acceptable, they must be strictly controlled. Limited mandates, regular rotation, immediate recall if they violate mandates. They are commissioners carrying out instructions, not representatives exercising discretionary judgment. This principle had revolutionary implications. It suggested any government based on representation was illegitimate. The people have the right and duty to exercise sovereignty directly and continuously. No constitutional arrangement could bind future generations. The French Revolution took these ideas literally. Revolutionary assemblies claimed to exercise direct sovereignty. They rejected constitutional limits as attempts to bind the sovereign people. The Terror justified executions as expressions of the general will. The inalienability also creates practical problems. How can complex societies function if every law requires direct popular ratification? Rousseau's response is that most of what government does is administration, not legislation. The sovereign people create general laws, government handles particular applications. But the line between legislation and administration isn't clear, and practical governance seems to require more representative mechanisms than Rousseau allows.
Rousseau's second major claim: sovereignty is indivisible. You cannot divide it among different institutions or create checks and balances. The sovereign power must be unified and whole. Montesquieu had argued for separating legislative, executive, and judicial powers among different institutions that check each other. The British Constitution, with its mixture of monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements, represented this ideal. Rousseau argues this approach is fundamentally mistaken because it confuses sovereignty with government. Sovereignty is exercising the general will, the legislative power creating laws. Government is executing those laws. Sovereignty belongs entirely and indivisibly to the people. It cannot be divided without ceasing to be sovereignty. When English theorists spoke of mixed constitution, they were describing mixed government, not mixed sovereignty. Sovereignty has essential characteristics making division impossible. It concerns only general matters. It expresses the general will. It is inalienable and indivisible. You cannot have multiple sovereign powers without incoherence. Modern constitutional theory tries to divide sovereignty: legislative power here, executive power there, judicial review over here. Rousseau would say this approach is fundamentally mistaken because it confuses sovereignty with government. Sovereignty is making law. That belongs wholly to the people. Government is executing law. That can be organized various ways, but sovereign power itself cannot be divided. The people cannot delegate different aspects of sovereignty to different institutions while retaining it themselves. They must exercise legislative power completely and directly. They can organize government however they choose, but these are forms of government, not sovereignty. There is only one contract in the state, that of association, and this of itself excludes all others. No constitutional settlement can bind the sovereign people. Every generation must be free to reconstitute government. Entrenchment clauses, supermajority requirements, constitutional limitations all attempt to bind sovereignty, which is impossible. This creates profound instability. If no law or institutional arrangement can bind future exercises of popular sovereignty, how can rights be protected, minorities safeguarded, or long-term commitments made? Rousseau's answer: these protections must come from civic virtue and proper understanding of the general will, not from institutional mechanisms. Indivisibility also means rejecting federalism. You cannot divide sovereignty between
national government and state government without creating incoherence. Either the national government is sovereign, making federalism fiction, or state governments are sovereign, making the nation a federation of independent states, or you have genuinely divided sovereignty, which is impossible. Modern democratic theory has largely rejected Rousseau's stark position, attempting to combine popular sovereignty with institutional complexity, constitutional stability, and minority protections. But Rousseau would argue these compromises betray the fundamental principle. Either the people are sovereign, or they aren't. If they are, they must exercise that sovereignty fully and directly. If they cannot, sovereignty has been alienated.
One of Rousseau's most controversial proposals addresses religion's role in the Republic. He argues that legitimate democracy requires what he calls civil religion, a set of civic beliefs that bind citizens together and support republican virtue. Traditional Christianity, Rousseau argues, is actually incompatible with republican citizenship. Why? Because Christianity teaches that ultimate loyalty belongs to God and salvation in the next life, not to the earthly state. This divided loyalty weakens civic commitment. Christians make poor soldiers because they don't fear death sufficiently. They make poor citizens because they prioritize heaven over the republic. Moreover, Christianity's emphasis on universal brotherhood and peace contradicts the patriotic fervor and willingness to fight that republics require. Christian meekness and forgiveness don't produce the civic virtue necessary for self-government. Rousseau distinguishes three types of religion. First, the religion of man, pure Christianity, focused on internal spirituality, no external worship, no political dimension. This makes good humans, but poor citizens. Second, the religion of the citizen, civic religion tied to particular states like ancient Rome. This makes good citizens, but often leads to intolerance. Third, Christianity as actually practiced, with divided loyalty between church and state, creating perpetual tension. His solution is civil religion, a minimal set of civic beliefs that the sovereign can impose. These beliefs include existence of a powerful, intelligent, benevolent divinity, the afterlife, rewards for the just and punishment for the wicked, sanctity of the social contract and laws, and religious tolerance itself. Crucially, these are not religious dogmas, but social sentiments necessary for being a good citizen. Anyone who doesn't accept them should be banished, not as impious, but as antisocial, incapable of sincerely loving the laws and justice.
More controversially, anyone who publicly accepts these beliefs but then acts as if they don't believe them should be punished by death. They have committed the greatest crime, lying before the laws. This proposal shocked Rousseau's contemporaries and continues to trouble readers. It seems to introduce the religious intolerance and thought control that the Enlightenment philosophy opposed. Rousseau demands citizens profess specific beliefs on pain of exile or death. But Rousseau argues this isn't religious intolerance. You can believe whatever you want privately. It's political necessity. Democracy requires citizens who care about the common good above private interest. Without shared civic commitment, the general will cannot function. The civil religion provides that shared commitment. It creates the psychological bonds necessary for citizens to see themselves as part of a collective with common interests. It channels religious sentiment towards civic purposes rather than otherworldly ones. Critics see this as totalitarian, the state dictating belief, punishing dissent, demanding complete commitment. It prefigures the civic religions of modern totalitarian movements, the cult of the supreme being during the French Revolution, communist civic rituals, fascist political religion. But Rousseau would respond that every functional political community requires shared commitments. Modern liberal democracies have their own civil religions. constitutional patriotism, commitment to democratic values, belief in human rights. We just don't call it religion. The question is whether Rousseau's explicit and forced civil religion is more honest than modern liberal democracy's implicit, informal civic commitments, or whether it crosses a line into dangerous state control of conscience.
Rousseau acknowledges a fundamental problem with his theory. Direct democracy requires small states, but small states are vulnerable to large ones. How can legitimate government survive in a world of powerful large states? The ideal republic, for Rousseau, is small enough that citizens can actually assemble, know each other personally, and deliberate collectively. Geneva, ancient Athens, Rome in its Republican period. These exemplify the human scale necessary for genuine popular sovereignty. But small states face military vulnerability. They can be conquered by large monarchies with professional armies and centralized power. The very conditions that make democracy possible, small size, equality, civic participation, make military weakness likely. Rousseau has no good solution to this dilemma. He suggests small states might form confederations for mutual defense while maintaining internal sovereignty. But he recognizes this is precarious. The military advantages of size and centralization are real. This raises a deeper question. If legitimate government is only possible in small republics, and small republics cannot survive in a world of large states, is legitimate government effectively impossible in the modern world? Rousseau seems to accept this pessimistic conclusion. Most existing states are illegitimate. Legitimate government is rare and precarious. But how do legitimate republics come into existence? How do people corrupted by existing society transform themselves into virtuous citizens? This is where Rousseau introduces his most mysterious concept, the legislator. The legislator is an extraordinary individual who founds the republic by creating its fundamental laws and institutions. This person must have almost superhuman wisdom, understanding human nature deeply, remaining detached from particular interests, caring about the distant future more than present glory. The legislator faces a paradox. To create laws that will make people virtuous, they need virtuous people who don't yet exist. To discover the rules of society best suited to nations, a superior intelligence beholding all the passions of men without experiencing any of them would be needed. Moreover, the legislator cannot use force. That would create tyranny, not legitimate republic. They cannot use reason alone. The people aren't yet capable of recognizing good laws. So the legislator must appeal to divine authority, claiming the gods speak through them. This noble lie provides the authority needed to establish the republic. Rousseau cites Moses, Lycurgus, Numa as examples of legislators who founded republics by claiming divine inspiration. Once the republic is established and citizens are formed, it can sustain itself through the general will. But the founding moment requires this extraordinary individual using extraordinary means. This creates serious problems for Rousseau's theory. If legitimate government requires a miraculous founder using deception, how can it be truly legitimate? If ordinary people cannot create legitimate government themselves, doesn't this contradict popular sovereignty? Rousseau never fully resolves this tension. The legislator seems necessary, but also seems to violate the principles the republic is based on. It suggests that democratic legitimacy requires an undemocratic founding.
This problem has haunted democratic theory since. Founding moments, constitutional conventions, revolutionary assemblies exercise extraordinary power to create the framework within which ordinary democratic politics will occur. But how is that founding moment itself legitimated? By the Constitution it creates? That's circular. By popular ratification? But the people ratifying have been shaped by the founding itself. Despite Rousseau's systematic brilliance, his theory contains paradoxes and tensions he acknowledges but cannot fully resolve. These problems have occupied subsequent political philosophy and remain contested. First, the legitimacy paradox. Rousseau demands unanimous consent to form the social contract, but then allows majority rule afterward. Why does the minority who disagree with the initial contract have obligation to obey? If consent is the basis of legitimacy, why does my dissent not release me from obligation? Rousseau's answer, that unanimity is only required for the initial contract, and by remaining you tacitly consent to majority rule, seems inadequate. Second, the freedom paradox. Rousseau claims that in obeying the general will, you obey only yourself and remain free. But what if you genuinely believe a law doesn't serve the common good and you vote against it? When the majority forces you to obey, how is this self-imposed obligation? Rousseau says you were mistaken about the general will and the majority revealed your error. But this makes freedom depend on being in the majority, which seems to eliminate freedom for minorities. Third, the representation paradox. Rousseau insists sovereignty cannot be represented, requiring direct democracy. But he acknowledges large states cannot practice direct democracy. This implies legitimate government is impossible for large states. If so, most actual governments are illegitimate by definition. Rousseau seems to accept this, but it makes his theory largely inapplicable to the modern world of nation-states. Fourth, the legislator paradox. Creating legitimate government requires an extraordinary founder using extraordinary means, including noble lies. But how can government based on deception be legitimate? How can popular sovereignty be established by an individual claiming divine authority? Rousseau never explains how the undemocratic founding transforms into democratic legitimacy.
Fifth, the civic virtue paradox. Rousseau's republic requires virtuous citizens who prioritize the common good over private interest. But how do corrupted modern humans develop this virtue? Rousseau suggests the republic itself will form citizens through education and participation. But forming the republic requires virtuous citizens who don't yet exist. This circularity suggests legitimate government might be impossible to achieve from our current condition. Sixth, the equality paradox. Rousseau demands relative equality as a precondition for the general will. But how is equality achieved and maintained? If the general will emerges from equal citizens, but creating equality requires exercising the general will, we're in another circle. Rousseau suggests the legislator establishes initial equality, but again, we depend on an extraordinary individual using extraordinary means. Seventh, the civil religion paradox. Rousseau demands religious tolerance as part of civil religion, while also demanding citizens profess specific beliefs on pain of exile or death. This seems contradictory. You must tolerate other religions, but only if you first accept the civic beliefs, including toleration itself. Real pluralism, genuine disagreement about fundamental values, seems incompatible with Rousseau's republic. These paradoxes aren't merely technical problems. They reveal deep tensions in Rousseau's attempts to reconcile popular sovereignty with effective government, individual freedom with civic obligation, and democratic legitimacy
with the apparent prerequisites for creating democracy. Rousseau's critics have exploited these contradictions relentlessly. His defenders argue that Rousseau identified genuine dilemmas in democratic theory that cannot be resolved cleanly, and his honesty about these tensions is more valuable than theories that paper over them with false confidence. Few philosophers have had more immediate, dramatic, and controversial practical impact than Rousseau. His ideas didn't remain abstract theory. They became revolutionary ideology, and revolutionaries used them to justify radical transformation of societies and sometimes mass violence. The French Revolution claimed Rousseau as its prophet. Revolutionary leaders quoted the social contract constantly. Robespierre saw himself as implementing Rousseau's vision. The revolutionary government's actions reflected Rousseauian logic, claiming to express the general will, demanding civic virtue, suppressing factions, creating civic festivals to build republican sentiment. The terror itself drew on Rousseauian concepts. If the general will is infallible, and if the revolutionary government expresses that will, then enemies of the revolution are enemies of the people's will itself. They can be forced to be free, or, if incorrigible, eliminated as obstacles to the general will. Rousseau provided language for this. Those who refuse to obey the general will must be compelled. Whether the terror represents authentic application of Rousseau's principles or catastrophic misunderstanding remains fiercely debated. Critics argue Rousseau's intolerance of dissent, demand for unanimity around the common good, and elimination of intermediate associations between individual and state logically lead to totalitarianism. The general will becomes whatever revolutionary leaders declare it to be, with no institutional checks. Defenders respond that revolutionaries distorted Rousseau's ideas. He never advocated violent revolution or purging enemies. His general will required actual deliberation by citizens, not declaration by dictators. His small republic vision is incompatible with revolutionary France's centralized state. The terror betrays, rather than implements, Rousseau's principles. Beyond the French Revolution, Rousseau influenced democratic movements worldwide. His insistence on popular sovereignty rather than merely popular consent inspired democratic activists. His emphasis on equality as prerequisite for legitimate government influenced egalitarian movements. His critique of representation influenced direct democracy advocates. Rousseau also influenced political thought more broadly. His social contract theory, despite differences from Hobbes and Locke, established the contractual framework as dominant in political philosophy. His concept of the general will, despite its problems, introduced the idea that legitimate authority must serve genuinely common interests rather than particular ones. His critique of commercial society and artificial needs influenced Marx and socialist thought. His emphasis on civic virtue influenced Republican political theory. His recognition that legitimate government requires shared values influenced communitarian critiques of liberalism. But Rousseau's legacy is deeply contested. Liberal political theorists see him as democracy's enemy. His general will eliminates individual rights. His direct democracy is impractical. His civil religion is totalitarian. His critique of representation undermines functional government. They trace modern totalitarianism partly to Rousseau's dangerous ideas about forcing people to be free. Others see Rousseau as democracy's true founder. Unlike Locke's representative government, where people elect masters, Rousseau insists people must govern themselves directly. Unlike Hobbes' authorization of absolute sovereign, Rousseau insists sovereignty remains permanently with the people. He alone among social contract theorists truly meant popular sovereignty literally.
Contemporary democratic theory largely rejects Rousseau's conclusions while grappling with his problems. We accept that legitimate government requires more than periodic elections. We recognize that representation creates its own issues. We understand that democratic self-government requires civic commitments beyond narrow self-interest. We acknowledge that constitutional arrangements rest on shared values. But we reject Rousseau's solutions. We accept representative democracy's legitimacy. We protect minority rights against majority rule. We maintain institutional checks on popular sovereignty. We separate state from religious or civic ideology. We embrace pluralism rather than demanding unity around common good. This tension reveals Rousseau's enduring significance. He identified genuine problems in democratic theory that subsequent thought has struggled to resolve. Can we have effective government while maintaining popular sovereignty? Can we protect minority rights while respecting majority rule? Can we maintain democratic legitimacy without direct participation? Can we sustain civic commitment without demanding too much? Rousseau's answers may not satisfy us, but his questions remain central to democratic theory and practice. Every debate about direct versus representative democracy, about civic education, about shared values in pluralistic societies, about the tension between individual rights and collective goods, echoes Rousseau's concerns.
The social contract remains one of political philosophy's most influential and controversial texts. Rousseau didn't offer comfortable answers or easy solutions. He demanded a radical reimagining of political legitimacy and challenged assumptions that Hobbes and Locke had established. Where Hobbes created absolute sovereignty to escape the state of nature, and Locke created limited government to protect natural rights, Rousseau insisted that true legitimacy requires the people themselves remaining permanently sovereign, exercising legislative power directly, subordinating private interest to common good. His vision inspired democratic revolutions and movements for popular government. It provided the theoretical foundation for insisting that the people are not just the source of authority, but the continuous exercise of authority. It challenged the idea that representation is adequate for democratic legitimacy. But his vision also produced its own horrors when revolutionaries claimed to express the general will while suppressing dissent. When dictators justified tyranny as forcing people to be free. When governments demanded total civic commitment on pain of death. This dual legacy, inspiring democracy and justifying totalitarianism, reflects genuine tensions in Rousseau's thought. His uncompromising commitment to popular sovereignty and equality produced insights but also dangers. His refusal to accept the compromises that make government functional in large, complex, diverse societies made his theory at once more radical and less applicable. Perhaps Rousseau's greatest contribution is forcing us to recognize democracy's difficulty. It's not enough to hold elections or protect individual rights. Democratic self-government requires active citizens who care about the common good, relative equality so all can participate effectively, shared commitments that bind the community, and constant vigilance against corruption of the general will by particular interests. These demands are heavy. Meeting them fully may be impossible in modern mass societies, but recognizing them as democracy's aspirations, even if imperfectly achieved, distinguishes genuine self-government from its simulacrum.
Rousseau also forces us to confront democracy's paradoxes. How can we respect individual freedom
while requiring civic obligations? How can we protect minority rights while respecting majority rule? How can we combine popular sovereignty with functional representative government? How can we maintain shared civic commitments in pluralistic societies? Modern democratic theory consists largely of attempts to resolve these Rousseauan dilemmas without accepting his radical solutions. We want popular sovereignty without direct democracies and practicality. We want civic unity without enforced civil religion. We want the general will's legitimacy without eliminating individual rights or minority protections. Whether these compromises succeed, or simply evade Rousseau's challenges, remains contested. Perhaps representative democracy genuinely preserves popular sovereignty through constitutional mechanisms. Or perhaps Rousseau was right that representation inevitably alienates sovereignty, making it free only during elections. Perhaps constitutional protections of minority rights can coexist with majority rule. Or perhaps Rousseau was right that either the people are sovereign, meaning the majority's will is supreme, or they aren't sovereign at all, and constitutional limits have alienated sovereignty to courts or other institutions. Perhaps large, diverse nation-states can sustain democratic legitimacy through institutional design. Or perhaps Rousseau was right that genuine self-government requires the human scale of small republics, and large states inevitably become oligarchies disguised as democracies.
These questions don't have obvious answers. Rousseau's genius was posing them so starkly that we cannot ignore them. His radicalism was refusing the compromises that make his questions less urgent but also make politics possible. The social contract challenges us to think seriously about what political legitimacy requires, not just what's practical or what we can achieve, but what genuine self-government actually demands. By holding us to the highest standard, that we remained as free and civil society as we were in nature, that we obey only ourselves when we obey laws, Rousseau forces us to confront how far our actual political systems fall short. We can reject his conclusions, we can argue that his demands are impossible, or that attempting to meet them produces worse outcomes than accepting more modest achievements. But we cannot reject his fundamental question. How can we create political authority that doesn't just replace natural freedom with sophisticated enslavement? This is why Rousseau remains essential reading despite his paradoxes and dangers. He represents democracy's conscience, the voice insisting that popular sovereignty means something more than periodic elections, that self-government requires more than protecting individual rights, that political legitimacy demands more than institutional arrangements that keep the peace. Whether we should listen to that conscience or resist it is dangerous remains the question Rousseau leaves us.
This has been Timeless Thinkers, Episode 4, The Social Contract, How Rousseau Reimagined the People as Sovereign and Invented Modern Democracy. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of political philosophy's most radical and challenging works. We've watched Rousseau take the social contract tradition of Hobbes and Locke and transform it into a revolutionary vision of direct popular sovereignty that would inspire democratic movements and revolutionary upheavals. If you found this exploration valuable, please like, subscribe, and share. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Do you think Rousseau was right that representative democracy is really a form of slavery? Can large, diverse nations practice genuine self-government? Or does democracy require small republics? Is forcing people to be free a profound insight about civic obligation or a dangerous justification for tyranny?
Should we embrace Rousseau's vision as democracy's ideal, or reject it as democracy's nightmare? In our next episode, we'll examine a thinker who attempted to provide practical institutional solutions to the problems Rousseau identified, showing how separation of powers, checks and balances, and constitutional design might preserve liberty without requiring the impossible demands of direct democracy. Until then, keep questioning, keep thinking, and remember, understanding what political legitimacy truly requires, even if we cannot fully achieve it, helps us recognize when our political systems serve genuine self-government and when they merely disguise domination with the appearance of consent.